Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the first paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being "The first conception of the art of war was merely the preparation of the armed forces." The text follows. Formerly, by the term art of war or science of war, nothing was understood but the totality of those branches of knowledge and those appliances of skill occupied with material things, the pattern and preparation and the mode of using arms, the construction of fortifications and entrenchments, the organism of any army and the mechanism of its movement were the subject these branches of knowledge and skill above referred to, and the end and aim of them all was the establishment of an armed force fit for use in war. All this concerned merely things belonging to the material world and a one-sided activity only, and it was in fact nothing but an activity advancing by gradations from the lower occupations to a finer kind of mechanical art. The relation of all this to war itself was very much the same as the relation of the art of the sword cutler to the art of the using the sword. The employing in the moment of danger and in a state of constant reciprocal action of the particular energies of mind and spirit in the direction proposed to them was not yet even mooted. So I realized that this text is kind of short, and especially compared to the ones that we have read before, sometimes even entire chapters at once, but I'm following in fact von Clausewitz's segmentation in paragraphs that we kind of followed since the beginning. And also I think that this paragraph is particularly important because von Clausewitz is going a look in here in a historical perspective at the moment pre-existing the art or science of war. Here von Clausewitz uses both the terms to to state probably that there are people who also use the term science of war, that we have seen how fundamentally wrong it is, as there can't really be a science of war, a positivistic approach to whatever is going to happen into a military context and pretending that things can go the way we wish by large margins in order to solve the equation. So there is no way to make it a science. It's properly an art, and by certain standards it's also a bit more complicated, but that's still the best we can do about it. And this is particularly interesting because it sheds some light on objectively a lot of military history, fundamentally, that is the one pre-existing fundamentally Renaissance warfare, right? And this will be clearer actually from the second chapter when von Clausewitz says that the true war first appears in the art of sieges, meaning that the true art of war appears in siege warfare, thinking about the evolution of the Traces Italiennes and then Vauban and all this stuff. We also discussed on Schwerpunkt at one point, or began to at least. This is an important statement, I mean, for a military historian of his caliber, but naturally also for the military theorist that von Clausewitz is. Because, as I said many times, von Clausewitz actually studied an enormous amount of military history. He wrote, I don't remember now, but something like tens and tens and tens of campaigns in detail for what is a real analysis throughout, a serious one, conducted on all the sources, something that can last even months or years, and it's something like I did only once. It took me 1 year to do it, and obviously also now I'm doing something similar. But von Clausewitz was really beyond. Right? So, and I can't sense the malaise that some reader might have by approaching this paragraph, because it may sound a bit like, saying that before, in this case, Renaissance warfare, there was basically no art of war properly meant, right? Here, it's a very difficult and deep topic to approach, and actually I don't have the skills nor competence at this point to make a deep consideration. Maybe one day we will make a video dedicated to it. But the concept is that objectively, even if you look at treatise production, etc., that is something that starts happening towards the Renaissance. What happened before was a bit like serpentine, meaning that, of course, there were moments in military history where things got closer to what would become modern warfare in terms of, in fact, of military theorization. We are talking obviously about kind of Hellenic or Roman times, or the Byzantines were particularly famous because of their treatise tradition, and that obviously stems from contexts that saw something relatively similar to what would happen in the modern age, with the Middle Ages, in fact, in the middle. This context that is, kind of a centralized state with us permanent armed forces, bureaucracy, tax system that can put lots of military resources together, and that automatically triggers, historically, culturally, even politically, the need to produce, a reflection on the art of war, in this sense. That is, however, yet something that takes a lot to take off, even during the modern age, right? The main progression is fundamentally Machiavelli, Montecuccoli, and then von Clausewitz. Like, these were basically the three big ones between, in fact, the 16th and the 19th century. And naturally, these authors emerge from contexts that were, in fact, progressively structuring this permanent armed forces and centralized political direction and so on, that eventually with von Clausewitz we are in the era of nation state, obviously when state basically takes over all the sources of law. Well, it has the strength evidently to achieve this as well in terms of military theorization. But this is not really an intention, nor, as a matter of fact, a real thing in order to, to downgrade or downsize the military capabilities of the ancients or the medievals, right? It's a process that is today, I don't know how much overlooked, because I often aggress modernism by stating that, we think that everything is really like in a modern, starting to reason from kind of modern times or contemporary times, and this new world that has developed from a very few, just a few hundred years, basically. But also in here, I don't really know how much our societies at a popular level conceive what objectively happened during the modern age or the contemporary age, and how we can talk, especially for military theory, like in this sense, from the passage of, as von Clausewitz puts it, from mere preparation for war to the military art. But it's definitely something we have to reflect on. Not much for, in fact, backing the modernistic perspectives, like saying, before, like, this modern age was nothing like, everything was so backward, and there was no intelligence, no capability, nothing more false. Here we have really to be realistic about this, but to reflect, in fact, on the true nature of what an ancient, medieval context, from a military point of view in this case, was really about, right? It's like a bit with technology, if you don't want to put it to philosophical or, abstract in terms of theorization. That is effectively what also von Clausewitz is complaining on by recalling the term science of war, is, that you in order to make something, first of all, existing, like, and functional more than else, because discovering is a bit different from innovating, right? In order, you can discover something and do nothing with it, essentially, because there are not the conditions for that something to be applicated fundamentally. then in order to innovate, you need for this tool to be effectively usable, right? And of use. So it's like pretending, I don't know, in the early Middle Ages, they lost the technology for torsion catapults. And what did exactly early medieval people needed a torsion catapult for? For besieging a Moat and Bailey castle, right? You need that expense, that investment for that. Obviously, you don't need it, and you don't use it, and you don't bother yourself to think about that. So that's how we should start to reason a little bit, to be at least realistic and to have a real conversation about military history. So looking at the previous, if von Clausewitz here is looking at this previous side of the story, how it really was, and he describes that. I naturally think that von Clausewitz is contextual to his time as well. So this was a moment in which we have seen also in the introduction that I made to von Clausewitz's Life and Times. It was a moment of brutal acceleration of scientific discovery, technological advancement. I mean, talking about early 19th century Europe is talking about really something in the way, there was this optimistic, positivistic perspective that obviously von Clausewitz doesn't quite buy, but in some sense he perceived this innovation and naturally the effects more especially that this entailed. So this is even from the title, the simple is plain as that. The first conception of the art of war was merely the preparation of the armed forces. So he says, formerly by the term art of war or science of war, nothing was understood but the totality of those branches of knowledge and those appliances of skill occupied with material things. The material side of the story here is particularly important, right? So the term art of war and science of war in this sense were are pretty neutral, right? There was this, I don't know, ars bellandi or scientia, belli or something like that in Latin you could find, because there was evidently a military theorization, even this other, during the Middle Ages and so on. But also in here, I don't want to open too many digressions, but naturally you have to understand how much theorization at that point was some sort of, sometimes detached from the reality of warfare. We know it because when we read, let's say medieval military treatises, we observe that certain things can simply be true, and actually, but not because it's medieval stuff or that. It was part of a kind of a historiographical tradition at that point, more than an actual manual for applying it and magically making things work on the battlefield. Those who fought at the time knew perfectly what they had to do in order to make things work on the battlefield. They didn't need manuals. So if anything, manuals were just this very important, by the way, elaboration and conception and observation on warfare, and that makes us understand a lot also what was the relation between this world and the past ones. Thinking about the importance of Vegetius, for example, for medieval treatises in Western Europe, and so on. But there's still something detached. So in this context, the art or science of war was understood as the totality of those branches of knowledge and those appliances of skill occupied with material things, right? That is, simply, how does a thing work, right? How does a weapon work, an armor work? And be ready in order to organize the stuff and to provide it and to keep people with it. Obviously, it was training as well. We can imagine that it was sort of teaching, especially in the say commanding spheres that about which we know very few, because naturally men of war, especially during the Middle Ages, didn't quite have a big deal of education, at least in most of contexts. This is not entirely true, but I mean properly, even in terms of literacy. But there were even poets, or artists that I found it in here that were extremely effective and bloodthirsty commanders in some ways. But they probably have, they didn't leave anything written. This is a great problem for us. It's like, even look at the Roman times. The Romans wrote some military treatise. The Byzantine tradition is better, telling the truth, because it's much more developed and it's more like of a, kind of a more of an Hellenic background than a Latin one. In the sense, it's more intellectually vibrant by certain standards, but still, it's it's valid what we said before about the relative detachment between this different the reality, theory, and and practice. But even in Roman times, for example, we do not have information about, let's say, for example, NCOs, right? All the treatises were written like by filthy rich senators that, just because they were senators, were put in charge of legions that were sent on the frontier, and then we know just basically this higher view about what would be a sort of divisional or army kind of command. And we know nothing about the lower ranks, right? Yeah, of course, there is a story of some soldier that did something brave or cool, or that people wanted to remember. It happens, right? How many times Caesar writes about centurions and how important they were, and how much, that tells us about the Roman military. But it's not really a way of telling us, what how these guys were practically trained, or what they, we can spot that by analogy. We can understand there is a military logic behind this, but how NCOs were educated, were trained, basically we know nothing about that. In terms of real, like, direction, not just of physical training, which is obvious, they rose from the ranks and all this stuff. But we don't know how the machine worked, so we also pretend to know so much about, I don't know, the Roman army. We basically know almost nothing about the Roman army. Let's be honest about it, how it practically functioned. The same goes for the Middle Ages. So only with the modern age, and only in certain, from certain specific contexts, we start seeing how armies literally operated on the fields, because there was a more generalized level of education and of wealth that allowed more and more people to write and to discuss and confront about this stuff, and produce basically treatises about war, right? And this is naturally a direct consequence of siege warfare, how artillery had progressed over the centuries, and that's why von Clausewitz basically explains that such changes started appearing the art of sieges. That here do not really, probably von Clausewitz himself doesn't necessarily think of this in strictly like about artillery. It's obvious that that was a big deal, but when we'll see in the paragraph about sieges, it's really a matter of mental application rather than anything. It's like solving problems also in conditions of relatively slow tactical progresses in throughout time and so on, and technological development and so on. So here, what von Clausewitz is telling us is that, as if armies were fundamentally led with a certain amount of knowledge that surely they shared, they passed down to the various, these other various commanders, but that to which things really got pretty much blurred down the line, because actually, if you look at medieval times, who were military commanders really, right? There start being figures of people who, there was the big feudatory that was all about war, etc., but it was also about politics, of course, as always. But some people were just, elected from the city militias, or they simply participated. But the medieval times were also pretty highly militarized times, right? There are certain regions of medieval Europe that were, way more militarized in terms of actual participation to combat given numbers of populations than Frederick II's, Frederick the Great's 18th century Prussia. So it's important to understand even in terms relatively to Clausewitz and Trinity, how we always have to perceive war like, right? So here von Clausewitz is not properly making a critique to these times, like saying, these guys didn't even have a real art of war, sense of war. It was just about preparation of the armed forces. It just states something that is correct historically, is that there hadn't been these people didn't bother themselves rightfully because it was not needed to create like a fully developed military theory, because the way war was waged was simpler, was kind of more homogeneous. There wasn't any big, technological differences, or we tend always to emphasize this stuff, but actually, look at the Middle Ages. Take Europe, take Asia. They were fighting basically all in the same ways. There is no, you can say, that guys were more about horse archery, these guys were more about infantry, but at the end of the day, technology was always the same. The weapons were all the same. There could be some sort of improvements in, the quality of metal, of armor, or swords, and stuff like that. But it's, there are so many factors that intervene at that point, environmentally, in terms of availability of resources, that's not really a big deal. It's virtually ininfluent, right? We're talking about worlds where the asymmetry was pretty low, where everything was pretty homogeneous, and the whole thing didn't quite need sometimes more than just strength, right? Even in terms of order, etc. That's something you start needing when you start really making more, because you can move more, you can invest more, even in that form of in training and discipline, right? Think about the composition of medieval armies that were often put together, like with different clans or military retinues, and there was no real collective training at large organic levels. These are all normal, explicable, rational, logical factors that would bring as a consequence the lack of a real art or science of war, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, the pattern and preparation and mode of using arms, the construction of fortifications and entrenchments, the organism of an army and the mechanism of its movements were the subject, these branches of knowledge and skill above referred to, and the end and aim of them all was the establishment of an armed force fit for use in war, right? This was really the big deal, establishing an armed force fit for use in war, right? Even the progress that you find in modern history is really about, fielding an army at that point that, for example, is under single command, right? It was already a big deal when, as I was saying, we were saying now about political fragmentation. At that point, the real miracle, the thing that really makes the difference, is not how you train, all the various bands that you put together, because you simply can't do it. You don't have resources to afford that. There is no way to do it. The really big deal is how you politically unite these elements, right? And that you make them, for example, presenting on the battlefield in the first place on that given time that you need for fighting, right? So that's why you don't need other things. So von Clausewitz here basically lists all the needs that were practically required by this stage of military, of theoretical military development. And so the pattern and preparation and the mode of using arms, right? So producing arms, distributing, training people, using them, and getting this in ways that at this point were not in fact even necessarily issued by a higher authority, like in the Middle Ages, which was the knight who wouldn't know how to use a sword. That was needed because that person was framed within a political and social system in which he had to fight. End of the story. And then therefore that's something automatic that every lineage, every family, every clan would train its men for. So yeah, so obviously there could be an improvement in that. We know it. People cared about the quality of their weapons and how they trained a lot, right? Even in here, thinking about professionalism, do not think that, I don't know, that individual training, for example, over time is something that increased, right? A 13th century knight, I mean, he's obviously way more trained than, it's one of the peaks of military professionalism that you can find in every time in history. And a simple, dumb footman armed with a musket in the 18th century could take him out, with just a click, right? So the big difference had been done at a collective level, right? So always remember this, that on average and by far, with more collectively trained wins over the individually trained, right? And there is always both, of course, but the degree in here is changing a lot. And also in here, naturally, we would be equipped with certain weapons. We would know how to use them. This was something that society already set straight by itself. The knight went equipped the way he did, not because one day he went to the market and said, "Oh, I like this sword, I would like to buy it." No, those guys were basically all about war, unavoidably about war, and that was their entire life. And they would already have one. They would be trained since an early age to use it. And also here, the qualitative improvement of, for example, the material, how these weapons were created, was something really, more or less. I'm not saying all swords were the same, of course, because it is not true. But also the differences are relatively low, right? There are certain weapons that even in the modern age are kept being used from, during Napoleonic Wars. The worst thing, you could still use a pike. They did, for example, when they lacked even money for muskets. Ask the French Revolutionary Army. That was actually a good one, telling the truth. Things that harm and kill are always kind of good, right? If you had to go to war today, you probably would use a modern military helmet in addition to our armed forces. But if you really have to go out there, you have no option. Even if you had a medieval helmet, that would still do, right? Better than nothing, right? Even though you may say, well, there's certain standards could be even a kind of a hindrance more than, but that's relative. It depends what you have to do with that, where you are. So in here, what kind of theorization was kind of a theory in the art of war could be developed? Everything already worked by itself. There was no need for that. It was perfectly functional to that form of society. Why investing more into this, right? And bear in mind that naturally it was always a kind of an improvement, right? If you look at, from 11th to 15th century medieval armor, you see a big deal of improvement, but it took, in fact, like 4 centuries, and it's still relatively, there is no comparison with the improvement in weaponry, in the following centuries. So there was an improvement that, in parallel with which goes a greater attention towards the problem of the art of war. Let's say it's obvious that 14th century knight would be, a bit more oriented towards reading and scoping these ideas than a 9th century Scandinavian warrior was, right? But that's pretty obvious. There is nothing to add about it. Here, von Clausewitz talks also about the construction of fortifications and entrenchments. This also was important. It was actually a big deal of it. We also talked about this on Schwerpunkt, and I remember, medieval military engineers or something like that. Because especially this side of the story, that that in fact von Clausewitz highlights in the second paragraph by saying that, this art of war, mostly developed from sieges, right, is deeply overlooked, mostly because during the Middle Ages, treatises, literary sources in general, wrote mostly about they were paid by the elite and framed within the elite milieu in some way. So they wouldn't write. They would preferably write about knights and their great deeds and all in a chivalric idea and so on. Nobody would care about what the common infantryman did, nor what this kind of pioneers or magistri, as they were called in Latin, would do. But actually, if you look at medieval logistics and fortification and entrenchments, that was pretty damn developed. It was pretty damn developed, and it was a very, very dynamic. And it's very important to point it out at a level of of practical skill, right? Because if there is a good definition for the Middle Ages, that's the civilization of machines, right? In fact, the modern people tend to mistake this for like the modern age. The modern age was much more about the theory. In fact, that's what really made the difference. But that theory was possible only on the shoulders of this masters of this craftsmen who were able to produce things. In fact, like fortifications, entrenchments, even and naturally weaponry and siege weapons and other stuff that also in fact were theorized later, only when things were already developed. What do you think that the Renaissance came, these people began to build castles or entrenchments or something like that just because they had read it from a book, right? It's not really like that. It's because the state and society were developing, so they had the means finally to build things like traces italiennes, fortifications, but not because they had to learn it from something, from a manual, because they already knew how it was and just wanted to perfect this and to if anything, to write it down in order to repeat it, because they also had now the opportunity to build more than one that every once in a while, like there was for castles during the Middle Ages, right? Where naturally also the structures were much simpler engineeristically speaking, so that's also self-explained why you don't need that. But actually this quite material know-how was very, very, very important, and a lot of warfare gravitated around this, right? We tend to abstract warfare, also medieval warfare, like thinking only about flat grounds and armies against others without any kind of environmental context. But some of the greatest battles, first of all, most of basically almost all the battles were fought in the Middle Ages were triggered by a situation like, there was one guy besieging a castle and there was an army force that arrived in order to relieve that castle, and that's how the battle was fought, right? This is literally classic, and it happens all the times. Then I don't remember where I was going with this, but and then, for example, also when you find starting to find the major, even properly open field, the most massive, even with, for example, thousands of infantry resistant to cavalry, something like that, from the 14th century onwards, you find that all these battles that had a lot of field fortifications and entrenchments. Think about just the 100 Years' War, but just also the great, the wars between, the Flemish and the French. There was always a ditch, a stream in the middle. All these things were very, very, very important. And there was a way to replicate this basically everywhere. Even military camps were built like some sort of castles, right? Some of them, especially in the earlier times, it's basically what castles were and how they originated. Just like, in Roman times, Roman cities were built over the previous military camps, right? So, yeah. Then there is this other very important branch that is the organism of an army and the mechanism of its movements. This is really important. How you move an army, how you put it, you call it, you gather it on the field, how you feed it, and how you keep it together, given that there is such a low collective training, as we have seen, and usually it's made up of several different elements that are not very blended together, and they probably even don't feel much for each other, and with limited resources, by the way. There's still no centralized state, so for a fief or an abbey or a commune to put this armies together, like even a few hundred cavalrymen or in a few thousand infantrymen, was a pretty big deal, and they managed to do it excessively well, right? They knew that there is a striking homogeneity of in how these troops were really operated. It's all much more homogeneous than it seems. And think also about nets of communication, right? Think about what roads were during the Middle Ages, largely, right? And all the difficulties and all, think about war horses and how much damn they drank and eat, how moving these armies was incredibly difficult. Medieval logistics is pretty damn advanced. People, I don't know why, people think that, Roman logistics was never topped by anyone. If you look at statistics throughout history of armies and how much how long they marched every day, basically they did all kind of the same thing, right? Even if, of course, maybe there are, at least during the Middle Ages, it's much more homogeneous than it's thought. Maybe, a Roman army of the 1st century BC compared to a Celtic army of the same age would reading the Bello Gallic tells you, that there were substantial differences, but sometimes they were also maybe inflated to show how, order and discipline really work better, which they do, by the way. So it's a bit, half truth for sure. But as we were saying before, there is a pretty damn low asymmetry in the world. And here he said, Von Clausewitz goes on and says, where does the subject, these branches of knowledge, is skill above refer to? So it is true indeed. I mean, the treatises and the treatise, and all the other prescriptions and laws of mobilization and statutes and all this stuff, they basically issue more than else how, for example, someone had to be equipped for war, and how the matters of reimbursements were about. So this tells you that there is much of theoretical in these dispositions that do not tell us about the reality of war as such, and that that were carried out because there was evidently someone else that knew how to use it. To use the military instrument without needing to write it down, right? Also because war was literally everywhere. Like, if you were part of these communities, you would regularly participate to war, even if you were not a military man, right? There is a big deal, like the feudal elite, that is also a numerical elite, but also the rest of the population, as we recalled before, was often drawn to war. They fought, but it's not just about the military expedition. It's also because there was turmoil around. There were murderers. The cities had different factions fighting with each other. So it was normal in your lifetime to have maybe not taken necessarily part to combat, but let's say to be directly. To find yourself directly involved into it in some way, if anything, as a political community and so on. And many people would actually take arms. So it also depends naturally on which times and places, because if you take 6th century Anglo-Saxon England, it's a bit different from 15th century Renaissance Italy, but more or less. Let's stress this: there are not enormous differences, Like, and it's very interesting because I believe that as, in fact, as moderns, we tend to assume that, when we think about modern contemporary warfare, we usually picture, like, if we talk, I don't know, about colonial wars, for example, you find that, that there was the Westerners that fought against this certain populations, at least, that were still kind of, tribal status, tribal condition, tribal warfare, like, and you see this big difference, so that you can't say even, oh, look at how different they were. But what is dramatically underestimated in this sense, especially, and I speak from a Western perspective, as far as I've, seen with talking around, is how we tend at least to give for granted how also, the more a system is developed, and how much even small differences can make, right? And we often do it, we think it mostly about the Middle Ages, for example, than with modern contemporary age. Like, for us, it's more, it's somewhat easier to think, I don't know, that there were dramatic differences in warfare during the Middle Ages than there were, I don't know, in contemporary era between the same Western countries, for example. That's completely false, and that tells you also a lot how we are stuck as modern people to tribal mindset, fundamentally, instinctively, right? So that for us, it's and there's really nothing strange about it, if it wasn't that, this creates massive problems in our societies, to understand more easily a tribal context, or at least to be more receptive towards things like difference, etc., than it is in our own. Because in our own, it's really a big deal, right? If you study, I don't know, the history of World II, you understand that basically, a way you can easily interpret World War II is about how industrial production influenced the outcome of war. It's pretty obvious. You can't understand World War II if you don't understand, aside from, so it's not about the combativity. You can read World War II in many ways. Obviously, it's not all about that, but, study the industrial production of the United States, of Soviet Union, of Nazi Germany, or Imperial Japan, Republican France, or Imperial England, the UK, to say better, or Fascist Italy, or whatever. In order to understand, really what World War II was in terms of ratios of strengths or power, it's really a big deal. And even what happens on the field, in fact, is a direct influence of the resources that you have available. But it seems that it doesn't matter, right? It's because it's too complicated, right? It's too complicated to put your head around this stuff, because because it's too complicated. While tribal warfare is easier, like, it's cool, there's a big guy with big axe smashes people, everybody gets that, right? And that's instinctual, right? But we can't afford this way of thinking anymore, because it simply means that you don't care enough about things that are necessary in order to make our own societies work, and about which the average person doesn't even pose himself a problem about, right? So how we can address this now? Well, the establishment of the armed force. Excuse me, I'm just reading von Clausewitz here. Organism movements. Okay. Okay. So this sets of practical skills fundamentally, and having this armed force fit, most of all, to go to war. So it's not important to have the weapon that shoots the biggest, projectile, right? The problem really is, which still happen, right? Because, for example, I don't know, we even made a video about this, I don't remember how it was titled, but you see, for example, even during the Middle Ages, that certain monarchies, some of which with some great deal of good functionment and levels of centralization, take Plantagenet, England had, for example, this care even about kind of a stock of trebuchet and oppositely prepared projectiles and all this stuff. So organization does matter, but this is what von Clausewitz is making really the point about, that it's really being about being fit for using war, right? Because war, the way it's fought, is not that different, right? The real problem is having troops available. And in this sense, it's sort of a shame how we concentrate sometimes on what kind of weapon this guy's used, and it's all about weapons, it's all about art. No, it's not all about that. It's firstly a political problem, and that's really what makes the difference. Literally on the battlefield, because that determines who is there and who is not for the fight, right? So there's nothing to do. As modern people, we are too technologistically prejudiced, and it's the hardest thing. It's really one of the hardest things to erase at this point in history, in order to approach healthily military matters. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, all this concerned merely things belonging to the material world in a one-sided activity only. And it was in fact nothing but an activity advancing by gradations from the lower occupations to a finer kind of mechanical art, right? And this is, the fact that von Clausewitz uses the terms art in here, it really makes you understand how deep this author is, because he is basically telling you that kind of art was evolving, right? It was a way from, that obviously, even in a high medieval context, obviously the common levy spearman would have a kind of almost no understanding of what warfare was, while the cavalryman at the top, the great feudatory or the king, was much more about how do I actually conduct war, which is definitely something you can call an art of war, right? Even if it's not written down, even if there's not this great deal of intellectual application, but there is a real know-how that came spontaneous, obviously, with all the various differences that military commanders can have, and that made, in fact, a difference on the battlefield, and that was what made part of war being determined by its outcome. So, and it's interesting also here the term mechanical art, right? Here von Clausewitz says, it was a materially oriented world in this sense. It was about fielding the number of troops equipped in that way. That was already a big deal, right? And better if they were kind of already experienced, maybe they had received some sort of very mild training, right? But it was a one-sided activity only. It was mostly really about this putting these troops on the field, and yet it was this advance by gradations from the lower occupations, in this sense, to a finer kind of mechanical art. So it's as if naturally at the top more things have to be controlled, more things have to be organized, more things have to be thought, right? So that becomes, at those levels, there is naturally a more highly sophisticated military thinking, and it's always like that, right? Von Clausewitz, we have talked about this in the first book. Obviously, the intellectual skills throughout every army in history obviously are much more developed at the top on average than at the bottom of the army, right? And it can't be otherwise, because there is an automatic selection. It's how also human, aside from war, actually how human societies create hierarchies, like, right? The great chief, the chieftain, that is can also be a warrior, but is usually a wise person. Is not just the first guy, young, bold, bloodthirsty warrior that wants to prove itself. Is someone who has been through that and knows what are the limits of that approach, and now is kind of older and kind of an experience in a retinue, etc., that rules. So you see, in this kind of tribal context, for example, nothing about it was really rationalized. It's also like discipline. In a tribal context, you don't have a state that gives you discipline, that is able to beat you to death like a Roman legionnaire would do undergo during training if you do something wrong. So either you adapt or you're out. It's society that pushes you for that. It's this interiorized understanding that in order to make things work without a common training, common discipline, is that, for example, if you're a coward and you run away from the battlefield, for example, your family will not accept you anymore, and you will be an outcast. You will be dead for them, and you're out of society. So don't tell me that's not tough. That's a surrogate for the lack of a training in a standing army, but it's still something pretty damn functional, because that guy really needs to be out if he's a coward, because that means to endanger the whole system. So the system would basically that turns into culture, right? That's how white tribesmen have this strong sense of honor and pride and this fanatic loyalty towards the chieftain, because that's this not yet rationalized but understood, socially understood, let's say, comprehension of how society has to stick together with this kind of a common commitment, right? And naturally, war is one of those contexts where you need more common commitment than ever, because if anything, only the lack of unity in command and direction is detrimental, right? So it's that's particularly important. So going on, where were we? Von Clausewitz writes, the relation of all this to war itself was very much the same as the relation of the art of the sword cutler to the art of using the sword. So this is a kind of a good example. There is a big difference between knowing how to make a sword and knowing how to use it, right? There's still a middle ground. And this world evidently showed this, like, the sword cutler kind of knew what made a good sword, because he knew what kind of characteristics were required for a sword to work well, right? Today, for example, they had a kind of a, for our own standards, kind of a garbage technology, right? Today we can make perfect steel that, not even, I think, 15th century still is engineeristically considered today as steel for our modern standards. So we can't make a steel that these guys could only dream of, but the way they balance the sword is something that we, with all our technology, we're absolutely incapable of doing, and we will never probably be capable of doing anymore. Which doesn't mean that every sword was fine, like only 1 out of 10 was actually fine, the others were just waste, and that's normal with that kind of technology to happen, because you don't have, it's very empirical, right? But still they knew how what was necessary to make it work well, and then you needed naturally someone who could be trained, which normally this word cutler was not, and while a knight would be, and incidentally the knight is also the guy who has enough money to buy that sword, that used it and that needed it available, right? So here naturally von Clausewitz is talking about something else. He's saying, that there was no craft, no art at the time was written down and explored and thought on how to use the sword in this sense, which is true actually, because the first, for example, this is a perfectly fitting example, because sword manuals are something we start having, if I'm not wrong, from the late 14th century and the 15th. So it's like obviously there was something before as well, but mostly at one point would be oral, knowledge, like transmitted knowledge, and sometimes even sheer practice. and training that these guys underwent constantly. And the reason why they didn't write it down, that's to make you understand how stupid we are as modern people, is that because these guys didn't know. Those guys didn't need to write it down because they knew how to use sword without writing that down, right? And this is the real thing. So here von Clausewitz is absolutely not downgrading what these guys were capable of, quite on the contrary, but he is highlighting the different necessities and therefore the different levels of development of certain fields of human intellect that would grow functional when society was more complex to make things work, like in the times von Clausewitz is posing himself these problems, right? So yeah, it was that society was that simple, but it had it had those relative ways to cope finally with the problems they had. And in an economical perspective, that's all you need to do. Civilization doesn't expand because there is one guy that decides that all of a sudden we have to make a big leap forward. That happened in China under Mao, and like 50 million people died, and that's a pretty good example of how you really how these things happen. World slowly evolves on the base of need of the people in a free economy, in a free society that starts improving, sometimes sadly enough, just only when the problem poses itself, and they need to cope with it at that point, because otherwise it's, let's just live for the time we have, even if, if things are good for now, even if they're not, we know we can be better, but still, we are here sitting, looking at our smartphones, and that's it, basically. So what great accomplishment you're putting, what great resources and intellectual and physical strengths you're putting in better everybody's life. I frankly don't see it, right? And it's normal. Sadly or happily, how you wanna see it, like, from, right? And so going on, von Clausewitz writes as a conclusion, actually, that the employment in the moment of danger and in a state of constant reciprocal action of particular energies of mind and spirit in the direction proposed to them was not yet even mooted. So this is also really the same topic. Like, it's the idea that there was evidently a constant danger, but this danger was not big enough to trigger this common reaction to threat that went beyond the practice that existed at the time, right? So you can argue that, in fact, major even civilization improvements happen in coincidence with wars, right? Wars are devastating. They're kind of eligible for, being the best civilization destroyers, but they are also definitely some of the best civilization developers and hybridizers, right? So it's obvious that the metus hostilis is a big deal. This in the history of the West, we don't have this huge. Yeah, you can look, I don't know, at Greece when it was invaded by the Persians. It was a big deal at the time, but it was also not such an enormous and dramatic. I mean, for the Greeks at the time, evidently it was, but there are worse things that happened in the past. Actually in the future, at that point, like, there were civilizations that they were wiped out at one point because they couldn't cope with the threat as big as it was, right? Take obviously Native Americans, just to make an example. That's an example of someone who succumbed, but think in perspective at, for example, the Mongol invasions, right? Those are still kind of not really at the flat ground level, but in fact they were a big deal at the time. That there were entire cities and great centers that were literally destroyed. Think about Baghdad, think about Merv or or Kiev. So they were literally razed to the ground, and this obviously brought some massive, even mind changes that triggered some reactions. Like, this was pretty tough. How do we ensure that it doesn't happen anymore? Certain contexts didn't really produce a satisfying answer, because, as we were saying before, you need kind of a fertile ground in order to produce such answers. But it's obvious that other contexts, like even 13th century Europe, for example, in the West, I don't say it starts accelerating its military potential because of, the Mongol invasions, but it's obvious that from a day to another you see this human tide that arrives up to the gates of Germany, and basically you're helpless, and all the armies that you sent in get literally wiped out. Well, that maybe makes you reconsider a little bit how things have to be led. So these are naturally, here von Clausewitz identifies the gradation that probably he applies also in the historical perspective of how this changes progressively occurred, right? But they are important because that's literally how society develops, especially when it's pressured. And a big problem of societies is when they're not pressured anymore, and they kind of collapse at one point because they loosen it, they soften up too much. I'm not making it a moral problem. Sometimes it is. Actually, most of the times it is at that point. But you need to struggle, at least, to achieve something. That's as it's always been, right? So, what else to say? Here, as I was saying, it's a very short paragraph. We already finished it. So I would say for this time we can stop it here. But reflect at this point on how, for example, von Clausewitz here is literally doing a history of the theory of war. Is starting from a conceptualized past. Here's not even mentioning the Middle Ages, for example, because he probably doesn't even think of it in this fashion. I mean, he is a very smart thinker. He likes to leave it flexible, right? To make you see the picture just with the points that are really needed for you to think it, and then you have to reflect on it, right? So next time we will instead talk about the true war first appears in the art of sieges, right? And that's also a very important chapter. Paragraph, and there are very small ones. I may make more of them at once from next time, but because otherwise we will take literally 3 months, like more, in order to 4 months to arrive to chapter number 3. But we are still a good point. We have done like 1/3 of the Vom Kriege at this point. It's not a few. And I'm pleased about that. And let me check here about the... Excuse me, I'm just looking at... Yeah, okay, whatever. We will definitely see it next time. For now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now,